In a world that was, and generally still is, oversaturated with post-apocalyptic and other zombie-adjacent related media, Naughty Dog managed to take a tired setting and tell a story that resonated with so many people. While they had made good, fun adventure games like the Uncharted series in the past, Last of Us is what solidified Naughty Dog, in my mind at least, and as well as many others, as a legendary studio that was able to do more with artistic and cinematic storytelling than any previous game had been able to. Okay, while I did say this is a bad game, and I do stand behind that, in a show of good faith, I'm going to try and be extra fair to Naughty Dog and the game, and talk about some of the things that were done very well in both games 1 and 2, as well as some things that I really like about the series. So, be warned, from here on out, there are spoilers ahead for the entire Last of Us series. Right from the start, these games both look incredibly stunning for the hardware they're running on. The original game was finally able to push the PlayStation 3 to its absolute limits and somehow managed to look as beautiful as it did for the time with only 256 megabytes of RAM. How they did that is nothing short of amazing work for the engineers that crunched for days on end. I really hope they recovered from that. From the outset of The Last of Us 2, you can tell that the title of my video is a little bit hyperbolic. The talented artists and engineers that Naughty Dog worked into the ground developed quite possibly the most beautiful and realistic looking game to date. The amount of foliage, level of detail, and gorgeous recreation of a post-apocalyptic Seattle being reclaimed by nature is stunning. Even more so that they were able to achieve such a feat running on a PlayStation that was engineered with hardware not that far off being a decade old. I absolutely love the American Northwest, and being able to see and explore an accurate recreation of some of the more iconic areas of Seattle in a game was extremely enjoyable. I probably added an extra 2 hours of playtime exploring this iconic section of the I-5 around the Columbia Center. This is actually one of the few areas of the game where The Last of Us Part 2 actually feels like a proper sequel. The player is able to explore a semi-open world area at their own pace and get some character and relationship development between Ellie and her girlfriend Dina, as you look over the various ruins for supplies and story tidbits, usually in the form of notes. The section is still linear like the first game was. There are only several set pieces within the whole semi-open world where any meaningful interactions happen, but it does feel like an improvement over the old small corridors of the first game. In fact, one of my favorite scenes of the game happens in this very area and is completely optional. You could totally miss the area and the scene if you're just pressing forward to the next standard objective.
What was that? Nothing. Well, nothing sure sounds nice.
Whether for budgetary reasons or this was just them experimenting for future games, this one semi-open section feels half-baked and really only teases at what could have been an interesting evolution of level design from the first game. The rest of the game shrinks back down to linear levels, but at least gives you usually 2 or 3 paths to get to your next objective, most of the time. Sound design is the second area of the game where Naughty Dog has really improved upon in the sequel. At least where there is sound. There are vast sections of the game where all you will hear is a simple ambient track subtly in the background. While this can be used effectively to drive a sense of loneliness to the player, and it is at times in this game, It is used so often that it often feels like they either ran out of time or budget or just overused the technique. And based on the rest of the game, I'm going to go with the last one. Clickers and other infected in the first game were never really as scary to me as other people found them. Things sounded a little bit too human, and all I could do is picture the voice actors in a booth making silly faces as they recorded their voice Foley. The sequel makes them sound just otherworldly enough to be a bit creepy the first few encounters, and the first encounter with stalkers was obviously based on the survival horror series Dead Space and done quite effectively the first time. Speaking of Infected and Dead Space, I feel like the designers replayed through the sadly cancelled series before coming up with update designs for the Cordyceps infection for The Last of Us sequel. The stalker sections in The Last of Us 2 felt really similar to the, funny enough, stalker sections in Dead Space 2. The fungal growth that you see in confined areas of the game's levels seem to have been very much amped up and remind me of the growth that you see in Dead Space. And lastly, the Rat King towards the end of Last of Us 2 didn't really feel like anything out of this universe that they were trying to sell us as something that is plausible and realistic. Once again, it felt like it was straight out of Dead Space to me, and I could do nothing but laugh and remember my time playing as Isaac Clarke while I'm supposed to be engaged with this very serious boss fight. The fact that this is the only other real new enemy type in the game is very disappointing, and it makes it pretty obvious that Neil Druckmann didn't want the focus to be on exploring the Cordyceps infection further in the sequel. And that's fine, probably a good thing actually, because the logic of the human Cordyceps virus falls apart in this realistic world that they've built as soon as you dive deeper than surface level. But when you aren't exploring the big bad that makes the world fall apart in the first place, all you're left with is generic humans, which makes it a lot more of a challenge to keep the gameplay part of your video game fun, fresh, and exciting, especially if you're like me and replay the original game leading up to the release of the sequel. From a technical level, the game is very good and a proper successor to its previous game, but that isn't what made people love the original. It was the characters and the struggle they went through in the harsh world Naughty Dog created. And that is where the sequel starts to fall apart. First, let's understand the difference between what a story is and what a plot is. I like using this quote from E.M. Forster, which goes, "Plot is a narrative of events with the emphasis on causality. The king died and then the queen died is a story. The king died and the queen died of grief is a plot." The distinction is important. A piece of media can have a generic or done-to-death story while still being well regarded by critics and the audience because the parts that make up the greater whole were masterfully executed or done in an interesting way. Saying you didn't like a game or film because the story was bad is not a useful criticism, since most things these days, especially after the rise of mass media, are going to be recycled or inspired by something else. What is more useful is identifying why the plot or elements of it did not work in said retelling of a story. The first Last of Us game was never complex or difficult for the audience to grasp onto, nor was it an original idea. And for that matter, neither were many individual elements within the game's plot. What made it engaging and earned it a fan following was its engaging and unique elements within the plot that pushed things along throughout the story, as well as how people related to those small individual elements that made up the whole along the way. For anyone unfamiliar, or if you just need a refresher, the down and dirty version of the original game's story is that a real-life cordyceps, which usually infects colonies of ants in South America, as well as other insects, mutates and jumps to human populations, causing a large downfall in the normal functions of society.
These bullet ants are showing some worrying symptoms.
It's the Coopers. Something right with them. I think they're sick.
What kind of sick?
Spores from a parasitic fungus called cordyceps have infiltrated their bodies and their minds.
Tommy! Holy shit! What just happened? What the fuck just happened? Did you see that? Yes, I saw it. God damn.
This is the reason why. Like something out of science fiction, the fruiting body of the cordyceps erupts from the ant's head. The deadly spores will burst from its tip. The fungus is so virulent it can wipe out whole colonies of ants.
The number of confirmed deaths has passed 200. The governor has called a state of emergency.
There are hundreds and hundreds of bodies lining the streets.
About 60% of the world's population dies during the initial years of the outbreak. After experiencing one of the main protagonist's first nights as the fungus starts to spread, we jump forward 20 years where he meets a girl who has an immunity to the fungus and needs to be taken across the country to a government resistance group which is still looking to develop a vaccine. Simple, to the point, and probably pretty familiar to most people experiencing the game when it released at the height of the zombie craze in pop culture. Nothing about the story is fresh or interesting on its own, apart from the use of the real fungus as the plague that infects humanity, and it doesn't ask much of the audience to follow along. A dry and well-known formulaic story means that if you don't want your piece of media to be something people have on in the background while they do more interesting things, you need to have perfectly executed or unique and interesting plot elements. The engaging part of The Last of Us is how the characters are interacting and developing over time. The plot simply acts as a means to push that character progression forward as we go through the story. Whether on purpose, with the help of the actors really pushing their characters, or a mix of everything, The Last of Us created a superb cast of characters, especially our two protagonists, Joel and Ellie, focusing the game on their growth and relationship together. We see Joel go from a loving and protective father who failed to keep his daughters safe, to someone who would do almost anything it took to survive, to someone who would do whatever it takes to protect the person who came to be his adoptive daughter. Where the first game had themes of love and personal growth in a world that didn't give people much of a reason to, the sequel throws these themes out the window in favor of hatred and revenge. Neil Druckmann, the game's creative director, also claimed the game is about empathy and forgiveness, which we'll see is really only technically true, as none of our main characters really show either of those two characteristics until key times in the plot when the game is trying to make a point. While it is more than fine for a new game to tackle new themes, the true themes of revenge and hate chosen by Druckmann and the rest of the creative heads at Naughty Dog make it exceptionally more difficult to achieve that fine balance of a dark tone balanced out with moments of light. It would be a tough feat for any team to achieve, but based on the success of the first game's writing and storytelling, I think it was reasonable that I and many other fans who were excited about the sequel believed this team could pull off a satisfying second game.
So much thought went into this, and I know there's a lot of people that feel this trepidation about coming back to these characters and revisiting what that ending means and worrying whether that's going to spoil the first game. And you have to understand, we feel all those things as well. Like, no one loves these characters more than we do, and we would not do this if we didn't feel like we had the right idea. And the part two is really kind of doubling down on that, to say we believe in this so much. We're not trying to avoid it, and like, I've played with so many of the ideas that had different characters, and it never felt right. The Last of Us is about these two characters specifically. And all I ask is the fans of the first ones, put some faith in us, trust us, we're going to do right by you. So.
Damn straight.
And wow, was that assumption wrong. Now, unfortunately, there were pretty big key parts of the game that leaked online before the release date, along with some cutscenes that were either out of order and without context. This definitely affected a lot of the discourse that was surrounding the game leading up to its release, and I'm sure colored some people's opinions before even playing the game. It also led to a lot of bad arguments about the game being terrible because there are gays in it. Which I know is a lot of gamers' problems with any game that decides to feature LGBTQ characters in any regard, but come on guys. There are legitimate and strong arguments to be made for why this game is not a good game. Having to see a gay kiss or a trans boy in a game is not one of them. Actually, the queer representation in The Last of Us 2 is fairly well done. It's not perfect, but for what I think is the biggest AAA game to feature such prominent LGBTQ characters, they did a pretty decent job. Luckily for my experience of Part 2's story, I went into the game completely blind. I watched the 2018 Sony E3 press conference that showed a cutscene between Ellie and a new character Dina, as well as a brutal demo for the gameplay, but that was basically it. With the exception of hearing that 2 big twists in the game just existed, but no idea where they were, I managed to start the game mostly untainted by any spoiler elements that had leaked online. The game starts out in a beautiful, somber tone, expertly framed in a way that made me feel Naughty Dog brought in a well-respected film DP to consult for them. And while the cinematography throughout the rest of the game never matches those first few opening shots, the game is undeniably gorgeous. The attention to detail, quality of textures, foliage, and the amount of objects you can see on screen is jaw-droppingly impressive, especially for a console that has hardware not that far off a decade old. We experience a taste of what life has become for Ellie now that she has settled in the town of Jackson, a fortified haven of seemingly relative safety and comfort, with electricity and some staples of what old modern life offered. The pace is slow and deliberate, which I generally view as a positive thing in most media. Some of my favorite films take their time with plot elements and pacing, giving characters time to emote and to feel what is happening in the story. In my opinion, that is one of the greatest failings in much of modern media, such as the Star Wars sequel movies. They move through the plot so quickly, parts that are supposed to be emotional or impactful just have no time to affect the characters, let alone the audience, because we have to move on to the next plot point that has been packed into 2 hours and 20 minutes. There is a bad way to do slow and deliberate pacing, however. The gameplay elements of the original Last of Us weren't engaging enough to keep the player's attention for the entirety of the experience without feeling too repetitive, and Naughty Dog understood this, striking a balance between exploration, scavenging, action, and character moments that kept the player engaged. Part 2 does not, however, as we'll see later on when the slow pacing leads to monotonous, repetitive sections of the game. Once Ellie and her supporting characters are established, we're introduced to a new playable character, Abby. We're unsure of her role in the story for a few brief minutes before Druckmann starts dropping obvious and heavy-handed hints that she's in the area for Joel. Abby is the center of both aforementioned twists the game has, as well as being used as a plot device in order to try and attempt to drive home one of the main themes of the game. Is she effective? In my opinion, not at all, but as we get further on into the essay, we'll dive even deeper into her character. It's painfully obvious that we as the player are meant to see Abby as the villain. Within 2 hours of the game, she tracks down and kills Joel, the main character from the previous game, except she doesn't just kill him, she removes a kneecap with a shotgun, tourniquets his leg so she can then proceed to torture him for reasons that we, at that stage of the game, do not know. The visuals are graphic and gruesome, and the game does not skimp on including intense audio as well as lingering shots on what most people who enjoyed the first game would consider to be a beloved character. This is the plot for the entire game: revenge. While a simple story doesn't necessarily mean a simple or unengaging plot, it does mean your plot elements are going to be doing the heavy lifting to keep the audience engaged. The original Last of Us was simplistic in that it had just 2 people traveling across the United States in an attempt to find a vaccine for the infection. That is not a unique or generally interesting story. However, what made the game so wonderful was the telling of Joel's and Ellie's relationship and development together as they progressed through the plot. Another piece of media that takes a basic revenge story but tells it incredibly well are the John Wick films. Nothing in them is particularly unique or new. Most of the plot points are either bare bones, have been done before in other pieces of media, but the extremely well-paced and executed action, as well as the charming lead actor in Keanu Reeves, make for a very fun and well-received films. Unfortunately for The Last of Us Part 2, the plot never moves past predictable, uninteresting tropes and framing devices while having nowhere near as compelling of a character plot to make the story interesting. which after the first game is really just sad and disappointing. I believe that Naughty Dog, and probably Neil Druckmann in particular, either didn't realize or didn't understand what made the original game so good and compelling in the first place. Joel and Ellie's growth and relationship together is what made the original game what it was, and that is what people expected to see at least some more of in a follow-up game. People who dislike this game, at least those who aren't acting like children and being upset about minority representation, don't necessarily have an issue that Joe is killed by an enemy that he's made in the past. The original game heavily hints that Joel has done some pretty reprehensible actions in the past to survive, as it seems most groups have done in this version of the post-apocalypse. So more than likely he would have met someone who had it out for him. The biggest issues come from the way the narrative led to Joel's death. We don't find this plot element out until later in the game, but Abby's group isn't even out looking for Joel. They're looking for Tommy, his brother. They have a lead on Tommy, who they plan on forcing to disclose Joel's location to them if they're able to eventually find him. You wouldn't know this, however, if you just watched the game though, because when Tommy says his name, none of the other characters in the group react. However, they do react when Joel introduces his name, almost like the plot forgot who these people were actually looking for and isn't consistent with itself.
When the moon comes
I found Joel's brother. He's at a settlement out in Wyoming.
How do you know that?
Some fireflies who served with him got picked up at the wall.
Y'all doing out this way?
Just passing through. You two live nearby?
We do. A few hours down the hill. Y'all should come back with us, restock before you head out.
Appreciate it. I'm Mel, by the way.
Tommy. This is my brother.
Joe. Y'all act like you heard of us or something.
Because they have.
Not only that, Joel and Tommy don't seem to act consistent with their characters. The person who was able to spot a hunter ambush, who did what it takes to survive, seems much too quick to trust this large group of armed people they don't know once he and Tommy got themselves into this position. They are also very quick to give out their names, which I feel like neither character would do considering their past violent actions. You never know when you might run into people you've wronged before. I have seen some people defend this writing as the two got soft living in Jackson for 4 years, but personally that doesn't work for me. We're not shown anything like that in the game. Sure, Jackson is a functioning small society, but both Joel and Tommy are regularly going out to risk their lives patrolling the town's surrounding lands. Later on in the game, we play through a flashback that shows just how violent one of those patrols can be. Going soft could have easily gotten them killed on one of their many patrols that they venture out on. Sure, you can infer that as an explanation for this piece of poor writing, but nothing in the game supports it, and for me, it breaks my suspension of disbelief. Joel's death within the first 2 hours of the game, while not being the best creative choice in my opinion, isn't even one of my biggest issues with it. Getting rid of one of the most interesting characters that players have already connected with from the first game, however, does increase the difficulty that the writers have for creating an engaging story. It was a bold choice that Naughty Dog made, but one that dramatically fails because of the execution of the rest of the narrative. The reason for this narrative twist, I say with the biggest air quotes, is to kick off the revenge story that Naughty Dog really wanted to tell so badly. It's a shorthand way to get players upset and hating Abby, a new character that you don't know that killed a character you loved from the first game. The plot device is cheap and lazy, but the brutality and torturous nature that was used in the execution, no pun intended, does make it an effective one. From this point in the plot, we get to see Ellie kinda sorta grieving, or probably as much grief as this world allows, as well as a few touching scenes with Dina where Ellie visits Joel's house before leaving on her revenge quest. This one section is where the level design is at its peak. The game uses Joel's house to show the player more about his character and personality through subtle environmental storytelling, which is something we didn't get that much insight into in the first game. And it's just not audio cues. There are little details scattered throughout the whole house that tell you something about him. Things that you could miss if you're just moving from point to point to continue the objective. The rich and tactful storytelling is appreciated, especially after the scene we just experienced. And you can tell the beginning hours of the game is really where the creative leads seem to have put their time into editing and pacing. Unfortunately, this is where the cracks in the game's foundation really start to show. While the technical prowess of the game, in terms of graphics and sound, only continue to increase from here, for the most part, story, gameplay, pacing, and direction never hit the same quality level that we had in these first few hours. With the intro over, we start to really dive into the first act of the game. Seattle will be the main setting for the 25 odd hours remaining, and it starts out with a pretty strong impression. The environments were gorgeous in the beginning of the game, working your way through what is possibly the most dense, realistic looking, and beautiful forest I've ever seen in a video game. Seeing part of Washington's I-5 leading into the city is just jaw-droppingly impressive, as is the quarantine checkpoint you encounter as your first real puzzle in the game. The PS4 has allowed them to scale things up much larger than anything we saw in Boston or Pittsburgh in the original game. Traveling further into the city with Ellie and Dina, we eventually reach a recreation of an iconic section of the I-5 in what used to be downtown. Quite destroyed by bombings from the military and nature's reclamation, this still recognizable semi-open world area is the sequel's biggest departure from the original Last of Us game. As I mentioned earlier, I'm someone who loves Seattle and the Pacific Northwest in general. The virtual tourism draw, especially for how good this game looks and the current climate of our own pandemic, is very hard to ignore. Obviously, some sections are going to be changed, so stores are not exactly the same, and the city of Seattle in general has grown a lot since 2013 when the world in the game stopped, as well as when Naughty Dog started doing development on this game. It's kind of crazy to see how huge buildings have been constructed in the same amount of time it took to finish the sequel. The fun of exploring the reclaimed areas of, say, the Columbia Center or Public Library from a gameplay perspective actually feels more fresh than what we got in many later sections. You're given a map of the area, which Ellie updates based on things you find in the world you're exploring at your own pace. Many sections are optional, but give rewards such as weapons, upgrades, supplies, and the story of how Seattle fell into its current ruinous state under the WLF, a faction within the game. There is some time during this extended, quiet section of the game for a bit of character development between Ellie and Dina, and their interactions are suitably charming and slightly awkward at times in the most endearing way. Unfortunately, apart from this section and one or two more that are focused on combat, this is about all the time for development between these two characters outside of any cutscenes. Unlike in the original Last of Us, where Ellie and Joel spent all but the winter section traveling and surviving together, providing a lot more time for us to watch their relationship grow, Dina is sidelined pretty early on in the game, leaving us with just Ellie for the remainder of the first act. Why Naughty Dog chose this direction, I can only guess. The only logical reason that I can see is they wanted to alienate the player further from Ellie and remove much option for exploration of her character other than her descent into a dark, one-track mind seeking revenge. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. The only real development that happens during these large solo Ellie sections of the game is world building, which is definitely appreciated, as the player was much further separated from the downfall of the Seattle quarantine zone than they were with Boston in the original game. However, that kind of background lore, the idea of learning about people's struggle to survive during the height of the outbreak, was present in the first game as well, while being alongside the development of our two protagonists. And while there is more world building being done in the sequel, I can't help but feel it doesn't come close to making up for what we lose by not having two protagonists interacting together. The real goal of Act 1 is, essentially, watching Ellie's descent into a revenge-fueled madness. We watch her be disturbed about the idea of making someone talk, to carrying out the act herself, to having no regard for her friend or Tommy because she feels like she's close to achieving her goal. Obviously, this is the point of the story. We as the player are supposed to feel distanced and pushed away from Ellie. It's meant as a way to drive home the point that revenge is bad, very deep. It feels so clumsy and ham-fisted, though. The vast majority of the audience is already going to understand the idea about revenge. It's a common trope among Western stories, not something that's going to be seen as a profound message. With that said, I'm not even sure this works as a revenge is bad message either. The amount of effort going into this plot is pretty absurd, bordering on the fence of being unbelievable in my eyes. Ellie and Dina spend weeks traveling from Wyoming to Washington with no real lead to go on, then struggle in the ruins of Seattle to find any sort of clue that might give them a small chance of maybe finding where Abby is. Not once during all that time did Ellie think to herself how stupid an endeavor this was. Not once, as she was traveling together with Dina, growing closer to her, realizing that she loves her, did she think how Joel wouldn't have wanted this for her and it wouldn't have been better for the two of them to just turn back and maybe build a life together? The amount of suspension of disbelief this plot asks of me is extremely high. Too high for me before I even reached the end of Ellie's half of the game. But I kept pushing forward, driven by the memories of the good story that Naughty Dog had done in the past, and hoped that things got better. And there are short times that things do get better. Interspersed throughout the game are flashback sections. Ellie's flashbacks are different interactions with Joel that happened over the past 4 years leading up to this game. My favorite scene of the whole game, and I think it's many other players' favorites as well, is the museum flashback.
Did you know this was here?
Oh, you don't like it. We can head back.
Oh, shut up. Hey, Joel.
Ellie.
Don't you dare take it off. My birthday, my rules.
After you. Watch your head.
Whoa. What the heck?
Oh! Okay. Wow.
Wow.
As you look at all these buttons.
Oh, it's so badass. Man. Could you imagine just...
Happy birthday, kiddo.
What is this?
This is a thing that took a mighty effort to find. Take it. Close your eyes. It'll be worth it.
Okay.
Seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You're welcome, kiddo. What do you say we,
This scene alone carried me through most of the game. We see Joel and Ellie together on a hiking trip Joel has planned as a birthday gift to her shortly after they have settled in Jackson. Their interactions together are incredibly wholesome. We get to see a more relaxed Joel, and Ellie is able to be less focused on just surviving and experience some of the fun of being a kid for once. Dialogue between the two of them is sweet and endearing, as good as it ever was in the original game, and Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson put on performances here that are even better than the original Last of Us. It's bittersweet to see Ellie's love and curiosity for science and space exploration, a relic of the old world that she'll never be able to truly engage with in the way that she wishes. Joel is able to feel more comfortable being more like a father figure to Ellie, even more open, showing his love for Ellie. This is exactly the kind of stuff that I wanted from a Last of Us sequel game. Obviously, this type of feel-good stuff couldn't carry the whole thing. As I mentioned before, you need to balance your upbeat sections with your darker ones to make both feel fulfilling in a setting like the post-apocalypse. But getting to see these two characters grow together and continue their story as they move forward is much more in line with what I would have liked to see from a sequel. Unfortunately, this moment is short-lived, even though I probably stretched it out for more than most, exploring every little detail. We see this scene end with a dark tone about fireflies and liars, foreshadowing what is to come between Joel and Ellie, and their conflict over the ending of the first game, which we will dive into shortly. As a side note, fun foreshadowing I can get behind is this pack of wolves. It was a moment that actually made me laugh out loud with how on the nose it was. Because the flashback sections are so few and far between, and most of the time you're playing alone as Ellie with no real other characters to banter back and forth with, the only thing carrying the player through these sections is the gameplay, which is a pretty big weakness of The Last of Us 2. The gameplay in the sequel is basically the same as the first, clunky and stilted feeling. Character movement does feel improved, and while I still find the tank controls annoying, it at least doesn't get in the way quite as much as it did in the original game. I'm still not convinced that making your controls focused around allowing the player to step forward and back like one might actually do in real life is worth this style of movement, and not, say, the way the player character moved in Horizon Zero Dawn, which I think has the best third-person controls out of any game I've played. Combat feels mostly unchanged from the first game, mechanically speaking. The actual impact firing a gun has now is vastly better than the stilted pea shooters of the original, and melee combat feels more satisfying from a visual standpoint. But actually aiming and taking down enemies is still very clunky and annoying, and it seems something that Naughty Dog doesn't really care about in any of their games, because they all basically control pretty much the same. Why they are not able to make shooting with a controller feel satisfying when other studios are able to get things like auto-aim and whatnot well-tuned, I'm not sure. It's passable, but not praiseworthy, even if I had gotten used to it and was proficient with it by the last level. In the original Last of Us, these issues were overshadowed by the pacing, which balanced engaging character moments that were being told between the plot and little environmental puzzles with combat. When I may have started to get a bit fatigued by the combat, it finishes and we're moving on to a character moment or a cutscene. No one moment overstayed its welcome. The sequel gets rid of your companion for large sections of the game, especially with Ellie, so you're progressing through these levels that are probably twice the size of the original game silently, exploring for resources so you can then push through the many combat sections. The character growth elements that Ellie had with Joel in the first game, which I think is almost universally what most people liked about that game, last for only a couple hours with Dina. Ultimately, The Last of Us Part 2 gives you nothing to focus on but its weak gameplay for hours at a time. The majority of the character content in this game is shifted over to the Abby half, where you are generally with a companion, moving through environments that are filled with other people, and getting a lot more of those character growth moments. We'll dive into that in her half of the video. As I played through the first Last of Us game, I loved it despite the gameplay, not because of it. It was a means to an end where I could learn more about these two engaging characters and their supporting cast, watch them grow, and see where they ended up. If you're someone who enjoys it, that's great, but it was never the draw of the game for me. That was always the characters and their stories together. Bottom line, the original Last of Us knew the actual gameplay sections were not its strong point and had an appropriate length for the amount of story content they had at around 15 hours. The sequel just about doubled that time without having much more of a story to tell, not even considering if that story was even compelling. And I was pretty much bored through all of that extra time. After working through repetitive sections with Ellie, we finally get to something of a climax. Having tracked Abby to the Seattle Aquarium, she has a confrontation with Owen and Mel, resulting in their deaths, and Ellie discovering that Mel was quite visibly pregnant. This is apparently what breaks her, and she has to be helped back to their camp in the theater by Tommy, who was found by Jesse off-screen, but not before leaving behind the map you used earlier in the I-5 section with big arrows pointing to where you were staying. One of the most overused, unbelievable, and lazy tropes out there to force a conflict between two opposing characters. Let's focus on Mel for a moment. Yes, she was quite pregnant at the time she was killed, but neither her nor Owen's reaction to being held at gunpoint gave Ellie much of a choice but to use lethal force in the end. What else is anyone supposed to do in this situation? The whole scenario broke my suspension of disbelief as I watched it play out and see what the game was trying to make me feel in that moment. I can understand someone who killed in self-defense and then realized the person they just killed was far along in their pregnancy, causing more of a reaction. But what about the scores of women WLF members Ellie killed along the way to get to this point in the story?
Double kill. Triple kill. Overkill. Kill-tacular. Kill-trocity. Kilimanjaro. Kill-tastrophe. Kill-pocalypse. Killionaire.
Done.
How many of them could have been pregnant? Why were their deaths not given the same emotional impact as Mel's? It's just because their deaths weren't in a cutscene that was trying to drive a motivational change in Ellie, and it feels like incredibly lazy writing. Nowhere else during this game before this point do we get any indication that Ellie is anything other than this world's John Wick, except for her feeling a little bit bad about torturing Nora to death a number of hours back. Back in the theater, Ellie finally starts acting more like an actual person and decides it's time for her to give up this stupid revenge quest, only needing to have killed a woman she knew for sure was pregnant to finally start seeing sense. Because that makes such a big difference, not the hundreds of others you killed along the way, it was this specific one woman. Regardless, the left behind map trope allows Abby to find her way to the theater and our main characters, finally advancing the plot to some sort of climax. After feeling like the game was starting to drag quite a bit leading up to this point, I had hoped I was finally starting to reach the conclusion. Unfortunately, this was really only the start. We see Tommy taken hostage and Jesse unceremoniously killed as he and Ellie rush to confront Abby. And then the story stops in its tracks. When we fade from black, we see we're playing as Abby again. This was apparently the second big twist that I had heard was in the game, except at the time I didn't realize it was a big twist. The game introduces the audience to Abby as a playable character very early on in the game. I never thought they were going to spend lots of time and resources creating mechanics and the ability to play as her if she was only going to be in 2 10-minute sections of the game right at the start. I assumed that we would be returning to her at some point, so the switch here did not feel like some big twist to me. My assumption was that Dina was going to be killed based on how they were leaning on all of the character tropes of someone you expect to die in a story. I guess in that one singular way, Naughty Dog did effectively subvert my expectations by actually having Dina live through the entire game. This second chapter of the game is where we flash back to see Abby's perspective of events leading up to that theater confrontation. We see her father retroactively portrayed as this great person, part of the Fireflies and apparently one of the last known surgeons around, and the one person responsible for trying to find a vaccine to the human cordyceps fungus, which I think is a bit of a change from the first game. There are notes around the University of Southern Colorado campus that make it sound like a team of people are working on creating a vaccine. The space there certainly looks like it was set up for a large team, but I don't fully recall all those collectible notes, so we'll just let that slide. It's not the biggest problem with this plot point anyway. What's a bigger hang-up for me is this focus on the vaccine. So let's dive into that for a bit. In The Last of Us Part 1, the idea of creating a vaccine by using Ellie's immunity is really just background for the character drama and the development that we watch play out. It acts as a plot device to drive our characters across the country and into new situations. The details about it don't really matter, because the point of the game was never about the vaccine, it's about Joel and Ellie and their growth together. The sequel makes the cordyceps fungus and the potential of a vaccine for it the main reason behind the conflict in the game. Ellie effectively ends her relationship with Joel after finding out he lied to her about the Fireflies and the potential for the vaccine, and Abby starts her quest for revenge after Joel kills her father while saving Ellie. So, about this vaccine. Even if you're not one to nerd out about science topics like I am, you most likely know that bacteria, virus, and fungi are all different in nature. You probably know that you've never been vaccinated for a fungal infection, and more than likely, never even heard about vaccines for fungi. That's because any kind of fungal vaccine is on the cutting edge of research in today's medical world. It's not something that I was aware about until this game, and the focus on a vaccine and how it is brandished about as this MacGuffin of numerous plot elements took me out of the story to think about. Anytime the content in a piece of media takes you out of the story to think about how a plot element would work, instead of engaging with what is happening on the screen or on the page, that media has failed. When Abby's father is talking about killing this teen girl for a chance at making a vaccine for a fungus, I'm not fully engaged with the emotions of the characters. I'm thinking about how a single surgeon, who isn't even a fungal researcher as far as we know, could develop a vaccine for this fungus when it's not really something we have access to today, even with all of our medical knowledge and resources. Not only that, but continuing to focus on the cordyceps makes one wonder. How would the Fireflies be able to manufacture a vaccine when basically all infrastructure has been destroyed? The only bit of info we get in the game about manufacturing is the US government is somehow still able to manufacture batteries. The Fireflies don't have access to anything like that though, and if they did, what is the plan to distribute the vaccine to the remaining population? Would they be able to handle that fairly? How would they inevitably deal with the power position they put themselves into when they become the only organization to have a way for people to be immune to the fungus? Would they become just as bad or maybe even worse than how we read Fedra could be? And how would a vaccine work to save humanity in the first place? Many of the people we see killed in the game are not killed because they were bitten and survived the bite. Encounters with the infected are extremely deadly. They're killed by the infected themselves in their drive to eat. And it's not as if the cordyceps is a hypercontagious virus. The spores, which is the only way to become infected yourself without suffering an encounter with the infected, are only shown to exist in dark, damp places with little ventilation. Much like fungi in real life, you almost have to go looking for it before you encounter any. So really the risk of catching this infection should be fairly low now that the initial outbreak is decades past. So what's a better, more attainable goal for the Fireflies, you ask? How about creating an antifungal treatment that fights off the fungal infection? You know, like we've had for years as a real medical treatment? There, Naughty Dog, I just came up with a better idea than your game doctor that doesn't involve killing an unconscious, underage girl with no medical background. Checkmate, atheists. Speaking of killing an unconscious, underage girl, let's talk about the morals there for one moment. One, yeah, that's a pretty bad and reprehensible act they were going to do. Jerry the surgeon seems far too eager to sacrifice Ellie just for the chance at creating a vaccine for the cordyceps fungus. All the issues I just mentioned that come along with developing and distributing a vaccine alone should give him pause to consider his actions. And Marlene rightfully questions Jerry about if he would be willing to do the same act if it was his own daughter Abby, to which he can't answer, of course.
Are we the baddies?
Yes, you are the baddies if you decide that killing an unconscious, unconsenting, underage girl in order to have a shot at a vaccine of questionable usefulness is the moral act. Here's a question. Why not just wake Ellie up and ask her? Did no one think of that? Instead of finding her outside of the hospital unconscious and drugging her to keep her that way during the entire stay with the Fireflies, give her some time to recover, then explain to what's going on, tell her the facts, explain your ideas, lay out the options, and then let her decide for herself. The idea of legal consent in this world doesn't really exist any longer, so we'll ignore that for the sake of argument, and the discussion of whether a girl Ellie's age would really be able to consent to something like this is outside of the scope of this video, and probably Naughty Dog's ability to tackle as a studio, so we will pretend she can. She has, after all, demonstrated a lot of personal agency throughout this time that we see her on screen. As we get to the end of the game, we can see that Ellie seems to be suffering from a condition called survivor's guilt after surviving an encounter with infected that her friend did not, and talks about wanting her life to mean something. She very well could have chosen to go through with the procedure, even in the slim hopes of finding a vaccine. This is a story we'll never know and weren't meant to know at the end of the original game because it wasn't what was important to the story. What mattered was that Ellie had become a daughter to Joel during their trip across the country, and he wasn't going to lose another child. I know plenty of people that think the ending was ambiguous and left things open, or that Joel actually did a moral wrong by saving Ellie. I think it's pretty clear. Joel did the right thing by saving Ellie from being killed against her will. Ask any parent who cares for their child and they will say that they would do the exact same thing. Once Ellie was safe and free to make her own decisions, should they have talked about what she wanted to do? Yes, and Joel choosing to lie to her about the Fireflies is where the morally gray creeps into the ending. Unfortunately, the plot of The Last of Us Part 2 uses the ending events of the original game as the foundation for its story, and for me, that foundation crumbles as soon as you try and build anything on top of it. This isn't the worst problem in the game, and if you were able to overlook the poor foundation of the writing and focus on surface level stuff, that's great. But to me, this is an unforced error from Naughty Dog. I was very disappointed when the writing team could have basically chosen any direction for their characters, but instead chose to focus on the weakest parts of the previous story. Act 2 is all about Abby and telling her side of the story. We flash back to when Ellie and Dina are first entering the city and get the flip perspective of how one or two outsiders are having such a drastic effect on their patrols. So much so, it seems like it's a much larger group of outsiders. This is an interesting idea, but only pops up now and then throughout Abby's side of the plot. Gameplay in Act 2 doesn't change up at all, except you get your weapons and character upgrades much faster than you did with Ellie's half of the game. And that's a good thing, because the designers realized how unfun it is to completely wipe the progress and investment you made in your character halfway through the game. I think the fact that they understood and compensated for this should say enough about how the flashback format wasn't a great choice for this game's pacing. When we're not learning little tidbits about some of the members of the Washington Liberation Front that we're vaguely familiar with, we're learning about their struggle against the Seraphites, a religious cult that has established their own micro-society on Seattle's north side. It's basically any generic Christian cult you've come across in other games and films. There's nothing really interesting about them except that they communicate using whistles when they detect a threat nearby. Fun idea for the first few encounters, but just as with NPCs calling out the names of their dead comrades, it gets stale quickly. Speaking of stale NPCs, the entire point of this half of the game is to moralize Abby and the WLF to the player after seeing them as only bad people. Problem is, they spent the entire first half of the game detailing how the WLF was no better than the military during the time that the Seattle quarantine zone was active, and employed the same fascist methods that Fedra did after driving them away from the city, even going further and directly killing civilians who did not comply with their orders. I suppose if you're skipping every single collectible in the game, you have a better chance at seeing the WLF as good liberators. But it really doesn't take much to see that the WLF are liberators of Seattle in exactly the same way that the US is a liberator in the Middle East.
The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military. The honorable and decent spirit.
The player is shown scenes of Abby interacting with other WLF soldiers in the game, and everyone seems to be pretty happy and nice to each other. But is this really supposed to make us sympathetic to the faction? I'm sure people involved in the power structure of a dictatorship are nice to each other on a day-to-day basis. That doesn't make them good people. Nor does it help the player feel worse about killing the human grunts in the game. Why should I care about some random person I just took out as I hear them cry one of 10 random names, when I just heard their idle chatter bad-mouthing the Seraphites as subhuman and attempting to kill me on sight? There's another thing that really stops any attempt at making the player feel bad about killing NPCs. No one attempts to act peacefully in this game, or the original Last of Us for that matter. The first game actively tries to dehumanize enemies by making them look almost like they're infected, making it even easier for the player to kill them without any qualms, something the sequel attempts to go the opposite direction with. The player is never given an option of negotiating with another faction or person without resorting to violence, unless it's maybe part of a narrative cutscene, and even then, it almost always leads to violence unless you're dealing with a friendly character you already know. Being able to go through most of the game in a non-violent way, especially when dealing with other humans, and having the player choose to perpetuate violence, either because it's a reaction to a narrative beat earlier in the game, aka Joel's death, or because it was easier, has the potential to be a vastly more impactful point. Much more than giving you no choice but to kill, and then asking, don't you feel bad for killing those NPCs? They even had names. Well, no, of course I don't feel bad. You never gave me any choice but to kill them.
Stop!
When the player has less agency over what is happening in the game, it's reasonable that they are going to feel less ownership over what events take place. No, I don't feel bad that Ellie killed pregnant Mel. What is she supposed to do? Let Mel kill her instead? What about the 100 other women that we killed leading up to that point? I bet at least 1 or 2 of them were pregnant as well. Not to mention the fact that they're part of a fascist militia group that by all accounts aren't any better to the people living under their rule than the previous fascist they kicked out. So why should the player care? Games that want to have an emotional impact need to have players connect with the characters. By contrast, this was done extremely well with almost every character in the first game. You connected with them on some level. The desire for Joel and Ellie to just let down their barriers and embrace each other. The sadness of 13-year-old Sam trying to rationalize his coming doom as the infection slowly consumes him. And the horror of his brother's reaction to what he sees as his failure to protect him. Frank dealing with the loss of his partner. Sure, these characters might have tainted past to various degrees, but they all share some human goodness that we as a player can connect with over time as we get to know them. Act 2 of the sequel game puts us in the shoes of Abby. The whole point of this act is to get the player to go from hating her to liking her. So let's go over some of Abby's characteristics. She is a soldier in a fascist regime, loyal to said regime, killed a beloved character, and a character I was growing to quite like, seems to have little or no regard to anyone but herself, and even when she does help others, it's out of self-interest, kills anyone that's not part of their group on sight, and seems to have no purpose in life outside of fighting an equally despicable, bigoted religious group now that she's taken her revenge. When you stack so many negative aspects on characters and then try to humanize them to the player after the fact, of course the internal bias that Druckmann and crew are trying to overcome is enormous. I see many people saying that the whole scenario is the point, that it's supposed to be challenging to like an Abby character, and that it's a really deep way to tell a story. And in a better written plot, yeah, maybe that is the case, but for The Last of Us 2, all Naughty Dog accomplished is a failure to connect a character with the player because they were trying to be too clever. Oh yeah, and then we see Abby brutally beat a pregnant Dina, smiling and saying good as she moves to slit her throat after Ellie tells her she's pregnant. This is the character they want the player to sympathize with. I see any character do this level of harm to someone after they're incapacitated, especially to a character I was going to like. You can bet I'm not going to like them.
She's pregnant. Good. Good. Good.
Obviously, they're trying to draw a parallel between Dina and Mel both being pregnant. I suppose that we're supposed to think that Abby is the better character for not killing a pregnant woman, except we see Ellie become incredibly distraught when discovering that Mel was pregnant, whereas Abby is more than happy to kill a pregnant woman for revenge, only stopping because Lev said to stop. Are we still supposed to see Abby as the better of the two characters here? And why is Abby even as upset as she is over the deaths of Mel and Owen? Her relationship with Owen is off and on throughout the story. There's little to no chemistry between them, not even close to what we see between Ellie and Dina, that's for sure. And Abby seems mostly disinterested overall, apart from the incredibly cringy, out-of-nowhere sex scene. As for Mel, she really only seems to try and have a friendship with her because Abby's other friends want her to be friendly with her. We all understand the revenge circle metaphor that's going on. Just make it a little bit more believable, Neil. How about another unlikable character that Naughty Dog forces upon this Act 2 plot? Joel's brother, Tommy. Great character in the first game, and his very limited role in the first act is good too. But then we switch sides and he acts like a completely different person after returning to Jackson towards the end of the game. Tommy was measured and restrained before when Joel asked for his help, or when Ellie wanted him to muster a small army from Jackson to go after Abby for Joel's murder. Maybe revenge wasn't the right move, was part of his reservations for going after Abby and the WLF members. But now, after Abby crippled him, he's all about recklessly going after her based on a rumor, especially now that Ellie has a family. It's so out of character. And it's not that I'm against him changing in this way either. People do change, and a near-death experience could bring about such a change. It's that this is yet another case, one of many in this game, of show, don't tell. Something as drastic as a complete personality change is something the player needs to see and experience for it to be effective and believable. One line about he and his wife are separated now after getting back isn't enough. The past 20 years of Tommy's life were full of near-death experiences. First with Joel during the outbreak, then surviving after the outbreak, then as part of his time with the Fireflies, then defending Jackson. Why was this specific one time the one that broke him? You have all the time in the world to show that change in a character play out over the course of a game. And you have the talent in actors, motion capture, and animators to show the player those emotions. We get none of that on the screen here. Eventually, we get to the third act of the game, which is just a pointless repeat of what we saw already. Ellie and Abby both lost dearly in their quest for vengeance. We saw compassion triumph over their insanity for revenge, and how things can turn out kind of okay despite the fact that you've lost so much. The whole epilogue-like scene on the farm was a pretty nice and also bittersweet way to close out the game. If they decided to cut the game here, with Ellie feeling the effects of all the trauma in her life leading up to this point, I may have actually forgiven all the bad decisions Naughty Dog made to get to this point. Instead, Ellie gets the scent of killing again and leaves every good thing she has behind to go after Abby. Before this point, I felt like I was kind of able to start relating to Ellie again, just for those couple scenes on the farm. But Neil needs more violent torture porn, so we ended up with the last few hours of this wreck of a game. When you finally make it through even more repetitive gameplay, finish admittedly the best level in the game. Seriously, this feels like an old Rainbow Six level or something. It's really fun and actually worth replaying. Ellie doesn't go just kill Abby, doesn't just leave her to die at the hand of her torturers and slavers you just killed, because of course there's a faction like that in this game. They need to have a fist fight to the death. I cannot believe this bad fist fight to the death is the final boss. After ending the first game with a father saving his daughter and giving us the question, would you lie to your child? This is how the game ends. I cannot fathom how they went through this game and thought this was good. Not only that, but they undercut Ellie's descent into full psychopathic killer by abruptly giving her a flash of Joel, reminding her that he wouldn't have wanted this life for her. You know, like she already learned after telling Tommy that she didn't want to go on this revenge quest again, 3 hours ago in the game.
I'm sorry.
Well, I can't go.
But what about the theme of forgiveness, says Neil. The flashback to Joel is actually part of a larger scene here, where Ellie decides she wants to try and forgive Joel for lying to her about the Fireflies. So really, in the end, not killing Abby here is really about Ellie deciding that she forgives Abby for killing Joel. Except that one pesky farm section again, where she already learned that lesson when she didn't want to go back out for revenge and instead stay with Dina and their child. They already got to this end point. She already learned her lesson. You can try and make a case for all of the above, but the fact that the plot is so sloppily written and flip-flops back and forth to try and drag the game out for some reason means that it was ineffective at conveying any of its themes. It undercuts itself. Every possible point this terrible final climax could possibly make is undercut because Ellie already learned her lessons in this story 3 hours ago on the farm. I'm about 90% sure the only reason this last section actually exists is because they first came up with the idea of ending the game with Ellie no longer able to play guitar. It's kind of like the ultimate tragedy for her after losing Joel, since he taught her to play. It's her last connection to him. They didn't know how to get to that point though, so they wrote that sloppy final confrontation. It's Game of Thrones all over again. They had an ending that they wanted to get to, but no idea how they would actually get there in a satisfying way.
While Danny kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and Euron's forces.
Sure, Jan.
The most repeated line I see defenders of this game say, or really just people who like the game in general, is that people who don't like The Last of Us 2 are too attached from characters from the first game, especially Joel, and didn't want him to die or change in any way. plus add on not wanting to play as Abby for good measure. Oh wow, I can definitely tell that people saying that are not actually engaging with the criticisms people are making of the game, and instead they're attacking strawman arguments that no one who is seriously critiquing the game is actually making. Because, if you've made it this far in the video, you can very well see that there is a massive list of issues, and none of those must be solved by Joel surviving the entire game, or playing as only Joel and Ellie. In fact, I don't even think that either of those two solutions would necessarily make the game any better. Let me break this weak defense of the game down, going back to Game of Thrones references because it fits so perfectly. Back when the show was good, seasons 1 to 4, when George R.R. Martin wrote the material, yes, I will fight you that season 5 is where everything started going downhill.
You want a good girl, but you need a bad pussy.
It was widely known for killing off main characters seemingly at any moment. Even the well-liked ones weren't safe. People still liked the show, however, and didn't complain about these characters being killed. Why is that? Well, it's because their deaths were actually properly set up by the plot, and their possibility could be foreseen if you were paying attention to it. Ned Stark was a beloved character, definitely one of my favorites, partially because Sean Bean is such a cool actor. Ned dies in the first season, and yet I don't say that show is bad or poorly written, at least in the first 4 seasons, even though I was sad to see the character die. That's because the consequences to his actions were clearly set up throughout that first season, or book, and his death was a satisfying, if tragic, end to his character. Now on the flip side, Game of Thrones Season 8, where the writing was so bad it was glaringly obvious to everyone, does exactly the same thing that The Last of Us 2 does. It has a known ending point and lazily writes the characters to get them to their conclusion. Nothing is set up or foreshadowed. Nothing is hinted at in the actual writing. Instead, you get a lazy plot so full of poorly executed tropes that it is woefully predictable every step of the way. Part of that issue is the disjointed method of storytelling. Were it told in a more linear fashion, and you don't have quite so many negative character traits built up against characters like Abby, there would have been a much better chance to have a more deadly confrontation with Joel feel more earned. Maybe the player would even be on Abby's side at that point. Instead of well-written character development, where the player is able to grow their connection, positive or negative, to the character as they grow, what we really get are stunted characters that don't grow much, but change depending on whatever the plot needs them to do at that given moment. Joel is left mostly intact when it comes to the destruction of characters in this game, but that is mostly because he is only in the plot for a few hours. While they make him and Tommy behave in ways they normally wouldn't just to get them into the position leading to Joel's murder, we do kind of get to see more of him play out as one might expect. The conflict between Joel and Ellie over his saving her from the Fireflies feels forced and overblown. Going back to earlier in the video where I talk about the absurdity of that situation, but it at least is well performed by both actors, and their characters don't feel completely fake, even if the situation does. It's like every tropey movie with a generic plot where the main character has a friend in Act 1, they have a falling out in Act 2 over something that's always dumb and overblown, and they reunite and forgive each other by the end of Act 3. I can't believe we're at generic B-movie plot for The Last of Us Part 2 after the quality of writing in the first game and the same creative team making it. Now moving on to Ellie, she basically becomes not Ellie, and really not something that is even recognizable as to how a human would behave given the circumstances. She is completely unrelatable, nor sympathetic by the end. That was the intention of Naughty Dog, of course, but her sparing or forgiving Abby at the last moment does not redeem or restore her character in the end. She is still a completely different person, a destroyed character, and not a person I care to see what happens with in the future. If that was the objective of Neil and the rest of his team, then great job. But I want to know why destroy a character like this in a way that doesn't fit with her previous development and is just so unrelatable to the people playing the game. Abby is meant to be the opposite, a more likable version of what Ellie could have been. Except she's not very likable. She behaves very similarly to Ellie in terms of behavior. Both of them torture people. Both kill indiscriminately. The only real upside Abby has going for her is that Lev is her traveling companion. The dynamic between the two of them mirrors the dynamic we saw in the first game with Joel and Ellie, which I'm sure was intentional. And because Lev is such a likable character, he makes Abby look so much better just by simply being a presence in the game. That doesn't make Abby any better, however. She's only helping Lev and his sister out of some selfish desire for herself.
If I'm gonna die for me.
Then what are you doing here? Why did you come back for us?
Guilt.
Of what? You don't owe us anything.
I just needed to lighten the load a bit. What?
He may fall for your little act with these kids, but I don't.
There's nothing to fall for.
Isaac's top scar killer suddenly had a change of heart? Nothing to do with Owen, right?
I haven't always done the right thing.
You're a piece of shit, Abby. You always have been.
Sure, she might eventually come to see Lev as a friend and someone to take care of by the end of the game. Again, mirroring Joel and Ellie, just with reversed genders. But that doesn't change anything about Abby's character. She's still just as bad as Ellie is, they just operate in a slightly different circumstance throughout the plot. While on a technical level the game may have been a masterpiece, applying that term to a work of art means the entire work was masterfully crafted. Unfortunately, everything that made the first game so good, the characters, dialogue, the interpersonal relationships, are completely hollow shells of the first game. The writing fails on all but a few small intimate moments between Ellie and Dina and Ellie and Joel, and a couple moments with Lev. New characters are either unlikable, underutilized and developed, or unmemorable. The level design does not respect your time, gameplay mostly challenges your skill only through the deficiency of its mechanics, and the music of Gustavo Santaolalla is criminally underused, while sound design is non-existent in too many areas. There are a few high spots in The Last of Us 2, but not enough to be worth your time playing through to see. I actually think Joel himself summed it up best in this very game.
See, there's a sequel. Wasn't as good.